This lecture is going to cover plant and animal physiology, focusing on nutrition. The online lecture here will mostly cover animal biology, but we may touch on plants just a bit. Let me get set up here. Let me get my fake laser pointer fired up. All right. So when you eat food, you're doing it for really two basic reasons. One, you're bringing in organic molecules in the form of food. So remember organic molecules that you learned about in Bio 1, carbohydrates, proteins, those sorts of things, lipids. And one of the reasons you're going to bring them in is to get those carbon skeletons and undergo biosynthesis, which is when you take that food and you make it part of yourself. You grow. You make it part of your own body, part of your own cells. But some of it is going to be used to generate ATP and to do work. And of course, we bring it in and we break it down initially in the digestive system. Some of it's going to be lost in the form of feces, some of that initial food you brought in, and some of it will go on to become part of you. Now, if you're a single-celled organism, we talked about this when we discussed surface area to volume ratios, like this paramecium. It's a single cell living in an aquatic environment. Its membrane is in touch with the external environment, and it brings things in via endocytosis. So food is brought in via endocytosis. We form a food vacuole, which is like a vesicle. It's a membrane bubble, like a bubble around the food. And then that vesicle, or that vacuole, fuses with a lysosome. Lysosomes contain hydrolytic enzymes, which break down the food, and then that digested food can be removed through exocytosis. That's what a single-celled organism might do. But you don't have that luxury as a multicellular organism. You can't just have your cells all poop into your body because you would die from toxic shock. If you are an organism such as a hydra, you will have what we call extracellular digestion take place. That means, and we do this as well, a single cell digests food inside, right? But we more complex organisms use extracellular digestion. That means digestion that takes place outside of the cell. And so here in a hydra, we have what we call an incomplete digestive system, or you may also hear it referred to, and this is another important word to know, a gastrovascular cavity. Incomplete digestive system and gastrovascular cavity will be synonyms for our purposes in this course. They have tentacles all around an opening that we're going to call the mouth, and they bring food in, but recall that the hydra is only 2 cells thick. There's an inner layer and an outer layer. The inner layer is sitting here with a bit of water in the middle of the hydra. You can see the inner layer right there where the laser pointer is. There is that water, basically. It's not really an intestine. It's just pond water that's in there, and it brings food in. The hydra eats food, and these inner cells secrete digestive enzymes into this water, break down the food into chunks, and then they bring the food in via endocytosis. So they break it down into highly digested pieces, and they bring it in, and then they probably continue digestion much the same way that a single-cell organism would do. Because a single cell can't absorb, in this case, an entire water flea, an entire Daphnia. They have to break it into little manageable pieces and then continue intracellular digestion after they bring the food in via phagocytosis. So that's an incomplete or digestive system or gastrovascular cavity. What makes this different than you? There are no organs in here. This is just a sac that's open to the outside world. There's water in here, the same water that's outside the hydra. There are no organs in there. They secrete digestive enzymes in there, and they break the food down. Then they absorb it and digest it further. And notice there is no anus. The mouth is the anus. There's one opening in a gastrovascular cavity. It's the entrance and the exit. So they eat and poop with the same opening. All right, so We, on the other hand, have a complete digestive tract. This evolves a little bit later on if we map this out on a cladogram. A complete digestive tract is known as an alimentary canal. So gastrovascular cavity versus alimentary canal. It's a tube that runs from one end of our bodies to the other. And along the way, that tube has become modified into very complex organs. So we have a mouth, and at the other end there's an anus. And everything in between those two openings is the alimentary canal. So the things that your food directly passes through. So basically in us, food comes in the mouth, right? Goes down the esophagus, goes to the stomach, to the small intestine, to the large intestine, and then out the anus. So that's the alimentary canal. It's the tube that the food directly passes through. And along the way, there are various organs that are specialized for different tasks: absorption, digestion, etc. So we can see this type of digestive system in a lot of organisms, a lot of animals. So that includes things from earthworms to grasshoppers to birds to mammals. They all have this canal, and it's modified in different ways depending on the lifestyle of the organism. They have adaptations for different ways of living. So our digestive system is more than just our alimentary canal. It consists of that gastrointestinal tract, that alimentary canal, and all of the organs that plug into it that supply it with various chemicals to aid in digestion. So at the beginning we have the mouth and pharynx. That's the mouth and the throat, basically. And that's where food comes in. Then we have the esophagus. The esophagus delivers food to the stomach. It's behind your trachea. Stomach is where some of the preliminary digestion begins, but we'll talk about it. Digestion really starts in your mouth, but some heavy-duty digestion taking place in the stomach. Then the small intestine, where digestion continues and absorption begins. Finally, the large intestine pulls water out of your digested food and some of the minerals in that water. And then at the cloaca or rectum, waste is expelled. The word cloaca will come up occasionally. Cloaca is a exit for solid and liquid waste. So birds have a common opening for both. We have two different openings for solid and liquid waste. So your book uses a diagram like this, kind of showing what the digestive system might look like if it were made of glassware in a lab. We have the mouth, esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, rectum, and anus. The rectum is the very end of the large intestine. It's where feces are stored briefly before passing out the anus. And then these grayish areas here are accessory organs. These are organs that are not part of the alimentary canal. Food does not pass through the liver or the pancreas or your saliva glands, but instead those structures secrete items into the alimentary canal to aid in digestion. And then, of course, you can see it much more complexly drawn out here in a human being, and you can study that. I recommend you study that. You might even want to draw that to get the hang of where these structures are and how they interrelate. So step one, you go to the cafeteria and you get a Pop-Tart or whatever, and you're going to put it in your mouth and chew it up. And as you probably already know, depending on your evolutionary history, you may have different teeth depending on your background. Here, we humans have omnivore teeth of a typical omnivore. We don't have huge fangs, but we do have molars, and we have teeth for tearing meat a little bit, not to the same extent as a wolf or a lion. And we don't have the same amount of grinding power for vegetables or, like grass, like a horse would have. But the first thing we do, we chew our food. Guess what chewing does? I told you what the secret of life was already in class. That's surface area to volume ratios. Chewing increases the surface area to volume ratios of the food, exposing it to more and more saliva. Saliva is a lubricant, so food doesn't get hung up in your throat, but it also contains an enzyme called amylase. Amylase is an enzyme that breaks down amylose. Amylose is starch. So we begin the breakdown of carbohydrates in the mouth, something that you should probably know. So we break it into smaller pieces. We increase its surface area by mashing it and we lubricate it, and we begin the breakdown of starch, of amylase in the mouth. All right. Now birds, they don't have teeth, right? Different kind of organism. They're going to swallow food mostly whole and then send it to a specialized organ for chewing inside the throat, which is going to be the gizzard. But either way, we swallow our food. Muscles in our throat are going to contract, and so our esophagus is going to send that food toward the stomach, as long as we don't choke by accident. Choking occurs when perhaps your epiglottis, the valve that prevents food from going into your airway, doesn't work quite right. Food gets into your airway instead of your esophagus. So there's that gizzard of a bird. They have a little bit different setup. That food comes in, gets softened in the stomach, gets chewed in the gizzard, then hits the intestines. It's a little bit different. All right, so here's a diagram. We have this object that's in green here. It's called a bolus. A bolus is just chewed up food, okay? So it's food and saliva kind of mixed together. So mastication takes place. That means chewing. Mastication is to chew. The food is chewed. The tongue is raised. The epiglottis is going to help to protect the airway in just a moment. The food is swallowed. You can see that here. The epiglottis is going to protect the airway, as we see here. Food travels down the esophagus towards the stomach, and muscles are contracting all the way down. So here's my hands. Hopefully you can see them. This one contracts and this one contracts. Then this one contracts and this one contracts, pushing the food down to the stomach. This process of smooth muscle contraction is known as peristalsis. Peristalsis is a very important idea to understand. It's the involuntary muscle contraction that's in a rhythmic fashion, and it pushes food down to the stomach. One way to think about how peristalsis works is squeezing toothpaste out of a toothpaste tube. You start at the bottom of the tube, and you squeeze and you squeeze and you squeeze, and you work your way all the way to the front of the tube, and that pushes the toothpaste out of the tube. It's the same basic thing that's happening in your esophagus. Eventually, that food hits a valve at the top of the stomach. These valves are known as sphincters. That sphincter opens, and the food enters into the stomach. So here's an image showing you this peristalsis. So it says peristaltic movement. That's the squishing of the muscles in the esophagus, pushing that food bolus down the esophagus. So the muscles rhythmically contract and relax, pushing that food downward. Something you don't have to think about. It's just automatic. All right, we hit the stomach. This is where we often think about digestion happening. When you're a kid, my tummy, and you think of your stomach, right? That's where digestion happens. Well, that's not entirely factual. I mean, digestion does start there in a way. It starts really in your mouth. You flatten the food, you lubricate it. Amylase is being broken down. You swallow it. Peristalsis pushes it down to your stomach. It goes in through the sphincter at the top of your stomach into your stomach, and now it's going to hit stomach acid. So your stomach has gastric juice, which has a very low pH, a pH of about 2. And inside here we have hydrochloric acid and an enzyme called pepsin. If you can't remember pepsin, remember Pepto-Bismol gets its name from pepsin. Pepsin is an enzyme that helps to cut the bonds, the peptide bonds between certain amino acids. It breaks down proteins. So, in your stomach, you have these cells called parietal cells. Parietal cells secrete H and Cl ions, which create that acidic environment. And there are chief cells in your stomach wall. They secrete a compound called pepsinogen. See that ending gen, G-E-N? That's like the word genesis, or to start, or to begin, or to create. Pepsinogen is the beginning of pepsin, but it's not activated. It doesn't have the right shape until it hits hydrochloric acid. And then, just like all proteins that react to pH, that pepsinogen bends, warps, and changes into the active form known as pepsin. Remember, proteins have complex structures. So proteins start out, if you remember from Bio 1, with a primary structure. That's the order of amino acids. And those amino acids are what are being cut apart using pepsin, Okay, now you take those chains of amino acids and you fold them up, and they're held together with hydrogen bonds. You get secondary structure. You wrap that up again, and it's held together with many different kinds of bonds. You have tertiary structure. You take two or more tertiary structures and put them together, and you have a quaternary structure. Well, your stomach is knocking those apart. So when a quaternary structure hits your stomach acid, it denatures. That HCl is going to denature the protein, causing it to a lot of the bonds to come undone. The protein unfolds, exposing more surface area to the pepsin. The pepsin is going to find certain amino acids and break the bonds between them, chopping your proteins into smaller amino acid chains. And now those can pass on to your small intestine. Now your stomach itself has to protect itself from digestion, so it has a mucus lining that is replaced all the time. So it secretes this lining and then it replaces it. In the stomach, there's a little bit of absorption, but not very much. So alcohol and aspirin apparently can be absorbed through the wall of the stomach, but not a lot of absorption going on within that. And water, I should mention. Some water can be absorbed here. Not all the water you swallow, but a little bit apparently can make its way into the blood from the stomach. But there's no real digestion of carbs or fats in the stomach. Just the beginnings of digestion of proteins. So here is an image of the lining or the wall of the stomach. We can see these pits inside the stomach. Over here, this is the surface of the stomach. Food would be lying up here. Okay, so we have these pits, and inside we have cells, these chief cells and these parietal cells. Chief cells secreting pepsinogen, parietal cells secreting basically hydrochloric acid. When hydrochloric acid hits pepsinogen, pepsin is formed, and we begin to break down the food that's inside of that stomach. All right, so let's talk before we continue about some of the accessory organs that are plugging into your alimentary canal. That includes the pancreas. The pancreas secretes pancreatic fluid, yum yum. And this is a liquid that's secreted into the duodenum, which is the beginning of your small intestine, through a duct known as the pancreatic duct. This fluid contains a whole bunch of enzymes, lots of proteins, right? Lots of enzymes, including trypsin and chymotrypsin. These break down proteins into even smaller polypeptides. So we're taking those chunks of proteins that the stomach has broken down, and we're cutting even more bonds between more amino acids, making even smaller amino acid chains. Remember, a name for an amino acid chain is a polypeptide. Biology is a new language, right? Words are all kinds of new words are introduced and then used throughout your major here. So polypeptides are broken down into even smaller polypeptides, maybe even into individual amino acids. Pancreatic amylase is also produced. This is going to break down polysaccharides into shorter sugars. So we're breaking down sugars into smaller and smaller pieces. So we're breaking down carbohydrates. Lipase is also produced. Lipase is an enzyme that breaks down lipids. It takes those fatty acids and things and begins to break them down into smaller individual pieces. So we're breaking down pretty much all of those major macro molecules that we talked about in Bio 1. Also, remember, when that food leaves the stomach, it's very acidic, a pH of 2, so the pancreas produces bicarbonate, kind of like baking soda, and that is injected into the small intestine, and that neutralizes that chyme. Now, we haven't used the word chyme yet. There it is right there. Chyme, remember that food bolus? Well, you've hit it with acid, you've denatured a lot of proteins, you've chopped them up, now it's called chyme. Chyme is partially digested food. Some more things that are going on in here. I just want to mention that this is not necessarily secreted into it's not secreted into the digestive tract, but the pancreas has other jobs, including the production of glucagon and insulin, which are involved in blood sugar regulation. So there's more jobs to some of these accessory organs than just pure digestion. All right, more accessory organs. One of these really important ones, if you open up an organism in dissection, you'll see a very large organ that most students confuse for the lungs that fills a huge portion of the body cavity. It's actually the liver. The liver is the largest internal organ in terms of just pure bulk, and it's going to make bile. Yum, yum, yum. And inside of bile is bile pigments. These are waste products from the breakdown of blood cells and things, and it produces bile salts. And bile salts are an emulsifier. If you are any kind of chef or cook, you might know about emulsification. This is when you add something to fats so they will mix with water. So they have a polar end and a non-polar end. So the non-polar end can stick to the fat, the polar end can stick to water. So this is how we can get fats to interact with water, with our blood, etc., so we can transport them around. We also have the gallbladder. The gallbladder is going to store and concentrate that bile. So the liver has a lot of jobs, and one of them is secreting bile. Okay, that bile then goes to the gallbladder where it's stored until it's needed. It's like a little bag that gets squeezed and injects bile into the digestive system. So if fatty food hits the duodenum, the beginning of the small intestine, this is going to cause the gallbladder to squeeze, squirting bile into the digestive system, and that's going to allow us to better break down fats and get them to mix with water. So here's an image showing you the pancreas. I'm not going to worry about these cells up here, but we have the pancreas, we have the pancreatic duct plugging right into the small intestine, the duodenum here. Here's the liver. The liver has a bile duct that connects into the gallbladder, which then runs into also the duodenum. So if you ever have your gallbladder removed or your pancreas removed, you're going to have issues with what you can digest and how efficiently you can digest those different kinds of foods. All right, so the small intestine, starting with the duodenum, is where most of your actual chemical digestion takes place. This is also where you hear your stomach growl. Actually, it's not your stomach usually. It's your small intestine contracting and making noises. This is the major site also of absorption of nutrients. So you chewed up your food. You swallowed it, hit your stomach. Now it travels into your intestine. It's now called chyme, and it's neutralized by the sodium bicarbonate. Other items are injected from your accessory organs. And the small intestine produces some of its own enzymes as well. All right, so as that food now is being digested, broken down, and is traveling once again through peristalsis through the small intestine, those villi and microvilli are greatly increasing the available surface area in that intestine, so absorption is taking place. And those villi are loaded with blood vessels, so food goes into them. Food particles go into those cells, then into the blood, where they can be transported throughout the body. So here's a cross-section. Here's a piece of intestine showing you loaded with blood vessels. If we look here, there is individual villi, and if we zoom in on those villi, here's one zoomed in. You can see it has blood vessels in it where absorption can take place. And there are also lymph vessels in there, which are also involved in transportation. And then if we zoom in on the cells of the villi, or the villi here, we can see that they themselves have tiny little fingers on them called microvilli. So even the cells have increased their surface area here, creating a huge amount of surface area for nutrient absorption. So when you see the villi, you know, they're often almost look like a ridge. But when you see them in cross-section, they look like those finger-like projections that we've seen. It depends on the structure you're looking at. All right. So when you look at the small intestine, up here's the stomach. The very beginning of the small intestine is known as the duodenum. Then the central region here, we have the jejunum. And then the end of the small intestine where it plugs into the large intestine is called the ileum. They will have various functions, you know, once again, mostly digestion and absorption. So in the small intestine, once again, here's cells of a individual villus, and those are the microvilli here that you can see. Proteins are broken down into small chains or individual amino acids. They're brought in either through just typical absorption or perhaps through endocytosis or some kind of active transport. They're brought into the cell and passed into the blood, and then they're transmitted throughout your body. Carbohydrates are broken down by various enzymes into individual monosaccharides. Monosaccharides are brought in via, once again, transport proteins, as you can see here, into the cells of the villi and then sent into the blood. Now fat doesn't mix very well with water, but it mixes with bile salts, which allows it to mix well with water. They can be broken down further. They're going to pass into your cells. You can see here there's some more steps that I'm not going to get too worried about. They're covered with a protein, things like that, to help them mix with water more thoroughly, to be transportable and digestible. And they pass, in this case, into a lymphatic capillary, part of the lymphatic system. Once again, for transport. Eventually, they make their way into the blood as well. All right, now, we make our way into the large intestine. Food has now passed through, been mostly digested, and a lot of it's been absorbed, but not all of it. Not all of it has been absorbed. Now we reach the colon, the cecum, the rectum. So, the colon, its major function is to pull water out of that half-digested, or that all-digested food at this point. It's pulling water back out. So 9 liters of water is secreted into your alimentary canal a day. This is why you have to stay hydrated. And 90% of it gets pulled back into your body. Now, if your digestive system isn't working right and food moves too fast, then you don't have time to recover that water back, and you have diarrhea. And then you dehydrate very easily, and you could even die from that dehydration if it's not controlled. So, as feces move through the colon and down that large intestine, they're having water extracted. Other things that happen in this area, there are a lot of bacteria in here, and a lot of them are good bacteria, and they can break down some of that food further and generate various vitamins and things that our bodies need. And then that food makes its way to the rectum, where it's basically stored until it's ready to be passed through the anus and excreted. A slightly terrifying fact for you, 30% of the solid mass, so the solid material in feces, is bacteria. There's a lot of bacteria that live inside of you. This image here on the bottom of the screen is a fossil dinosaur, coprolite. It's a dinosaur turd. So we can find fossils of all kinds of cool things in the Mesozoic, and there's an example for you. All right, so here's the large intestine. Here's the ileum, the end of the small intestine. It enters into the large intestine. I want to show you a couple things here. This area right here is called the cecum. The cecum is typically an area where bacteria live that might aid in further breakdown of materials. In us, our cecum is pretty small. At the end of our cecum is our appendix. And then we have the ascending colon. It goes up. Okay, ascending colon, then transverse colon, which goes sideways, then descending colon, which goes down, and then lastly the sigmoid colon, which looks like an S if you use your imagination. At the end of the sigmoid colon is the rectum, and then the anus at the very end. Okay, so those are the major parts of the colon. Depending on your evolutionary history and your food preferences, due to that evolutionary history, you may have a slightly different cecum, a slightly different digestive system altogether. So here's a carnivore. Here's a fox stomach, and that fox has a large small intestine. I shouldn't say large, small, a long small intestine, and it has a very tiny little cecum and a pretty big large intestine. So meat comes into the stomach. Meat is mostly protein. It gets denatured and then further denatured and broken down and absorbed in the small intestine, and then up here water is expelled or pulled out of that food, and then the waste is expelled. Now, here we have the digestive tract of an herbivore. So a koala bear in this case. It eats plant matter. Plant matter is hard to digest. If you remember, plants have a lot of cellulose in their cell walls, which is not really very easily digested. All of those beta glucose monomers held together to form cellulose, if you recall from Bio 1. So that food, once again brought in, proteins denatured in the stomach. We go into the small intestine, things are further broken down, but some of that plant matter is not going to be easily broken down yet. But we get down here to the cecum. Here we have a great big cecum. Now notice the cecum is a dead-end tube. So food generally isn't going to go up into that cecum, but the cecum houses bacteria. Bacteria that often have enzymes that can break down cellulose. So they're going to help to break down cellulose and help this herbivore to absorb some of that cellulose. And then what's left, so that food is going to have those enzymes. So that cellulose is going to get broken down into sugar. And then as the large intestine absorbs water out of that food, that digested sugar will pass into the bloodstream as well. So a little bit of absorption of sugars in that case, and the large intestine of these herbivores especially. Not so much in us or in carnivores, but in herbivores with a big cecum you will see that. And then the food passes its way through and out. There are other highly adapted, highly evolved, if you will, digestive systems in other organisms. Think of a cow with their many chambered stomachs, right? They have all these different chambers in their digestive system. Those chambers house symbiotic organisms like bacteria and perhaps archaea that help them to break down grass. Herbivores have a heck of a time getting enough energy out of grass and other vegetation because it's so hard to digest. So they have to have help from bacteria, from archaea, and sometimes other eukaryotes, little eukaryotes might even be in there helping them to digest that plant material. So all in all, everything can be kind of diagrammed like this. You take your food and you chew it up. Your saliva glands secrete amylase and lubricate that food. The food's chewed, increasing its surface area. It travels down the esophagus via peristalsis, hits the stomach, comes in through the sphincter here, goes into the stomach where it's exposed to high concentrations of acid. That denatures proteins, further exposing more surface area of those proteins to the enzymes that break the proteins apart. In this case, pepsin. Then that food is going to go out the pyloric sphincter into the small intestine, where it's going to be hit with more enzymes from the pancreas. It's going to be hit with bile, and it's going to also be neutralized with bicarbonate to get it to, we don't want that chyme to digest the small intestine, so we neutralize it. Lots of enzymes produced by the small intestine as well. Further digestion and absorption takes place of nutrients, and then we hit the large intestine where we're going to pull water back out of that food, and then that way our solid waste is solid, not liquid, and it leaves, stored in the rectum, then leaves the anus. And that's the basics of animal digestion. So when we pick up in class, I'm going to also mention what plants do a little bit. We won't spend as much time on plants because they don't digest, but we'll talk about nutrition, plants, and we'll tie the two together and wrap up from there. All right, I'll see you very, very soon.